All right, folks are coming in. I'm going to wait a couple minutes to let everyone join. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll introduce our speakers shortly and get started. We'll just give it a few minutes. All right, it's looking like stable numbers here. So let's get started. I think my screen is sharing. You can see that title slide there. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to HDSA's research webinar series. I'm Dr. Leora Fox. I'm the Assistant Director of Research and Patient Engagement at HDSA. I'm also joined by Dr. Eric Johnson, HDSA's Chief Mission Officer, and our Coordinator of Research and Mission Programs, Kelly Andrew, is also on the line. Today we are here to discuss a topic that's sensitive but very important, and that is brain donation for HD research. We have a panel of experts here that includes a variety of research and medical and family perspectives, and I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. But I first just want to remind you about how we handle Q&A at HDSA webinars. So first, our panelists are going to be making presentations and talking to you, and then they're going to address questions after they present their slides. But at any time, you can type your questions into the chat box in your Zoom toolbar. This is a closed chat, so only HDSA and our panelists will be able to see what you've asked. We will pose your questions to the panelists at the end. We do try to keep our focus on questions with broad relevance and to keep things anonymous rather than personal. So if we aren't able to answer all of your questions today, you're welcome to reach out to HDSA. We're happy to help follow up with our speakers. We are recording today, so if you want to watch this presentation later or send it to somebody else, you can go to hdsa.org/researchwebinars, or you can go to HDSA's YouTube channel using the button at the top of our homepage. Usually it's up within the day, if not within a couple of days. I'm not able to move to the next slide. Everything is frozen here. Huh. Oh, I clicked on something. That's why. I'm sorry. I'm sharing the wrong screen here. All right, sorry, back on track now. Okay, so to learn about other upcoming HDSA webinars, you can join our mailing list. You can check out hdsa.org/researchwebinars, hdsa.org/disability chat. That's another series hosted by HDSA's resident disability attorney, Allison Bartlett. If you're interested in other types of information about HD or social services available through HDSA, you can see what we have to offer at hdsa.org/support. If you want to help support the programs that we offer to those affected by HD, you can visit hdsa.org/donate. For specific research info and opportunities, you can follow HDSA's social media, our research blog, or HDSA's hdtrialfinder.org to learn more about currently recruiting clinical trials, as well as our surveys page, hdsa.org/surveys. There's lots of different ways to contribute to HD research from home. So I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. We have today Dr. Sam Frank, who's a movement disorder neurologist and the director of HDSA's Center of Excellence at Beth Israel. It's a teaching hospital within Harvard Medical School. He was a member of HDSA's Board of Trustees, is currently the co-chair of the Huntington Study Group Executive Membership Committee, and is also the inpatient neurology consultant for the specialized HD service at Tewksbury Hospital. Dr. Sabina Beretta, Dr. Steve McCarroll runs the lab at Harvard, and his mission is to develop new ways of monitoring biology and genetics and to apply these technologies in ways that are relevant to humans to help reveal the biological basis of health and disease, including HD. Dr. Sabina Beretta is a researcher in the field of brain disorders and the director of the Harvard Brain Tissue Resource Center. Her main research interest is in emotional dysregulation and psychiatric symptoms as they manifest in HD and lots of other nervous system disorders. And she Her work at the Harvard Brain Bank aims to foster rigorous research on the human brain by scientists across the world. And finally, Cheryl Sullivan Stavely is a retired RN who has 33 years of personal experience with HD. She's been a longtime HDSA advocate and educator in various capacities and is a member of HD COPE and facilitates 2 support groups. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sam Frank to talk a little bit about brain donation.
Great, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I don't have any slides because really what I'm talking about is everyday experience in terms of what I do and what patients and families go through. So I wanted to spend a couple minutes about brain donation and how it comes up in clinic. And as you mentioned, I'm the neurologist for a specialized service at Tewksbury Hospital. So I want to talk about that as well as follow-up. So those kind of 3 topics. In terms of clinic, it's very interesting to hear patients and families sometimes bring this up, sometimes very early on in the course of Huntington's disease and patients' journeys. We do like to bring this up at some point, just like we bring up advanced directives. We make it part of the MOLST when that comes up. And I think that a lot of patients and families are very interested in participating in all different kinds of research. And we see this as one other way of doing that, kind of an ultimate donation. And we certainly encourage people to find the right pathway for them and to make their preferences known early on. Just like we talk about advanced directives, we really try and make it part of that conversation because it is a way to contribute to research. I think patients and families know that and appreciate that. And so that's very kind of early on. And when people advance through the disease and may need 24-hour care, they may enter a facility or situation where they are, I don't want to say obligated to, but advanced directives are very much discussed, as well as at least a monthly case conference with the patient's family. And that's what we do at Tewksbury Hospital. So at Tewksbury Hospital, we on average have about 50 patients that have Huntington's disease, that have a wide variety of cognitive, physical, and behavioral manifestations that make it so that they can't function in the community any further and need further support. And patients can be in that state from a few years to a few decades. And so this is not an imminent kind of place. We're not talking about hospice type of care, although that is available when appropriate. But I think when talking about preferences of what people may want related to CPR or feeding tubes, again, that we just make this part of the normal conversation that we talk about in terms of what people would like after they pass, including brain donation. And we try and find a service that can facilitate what patients and families prefer to do with minimal effort and minimal cost, which is one of the reasons that we prefer to partner, and you'll hear a little bit later from Dr. Beretta, but we prefer to partner with McLean Hospital since they make the process quite seamless and very easy for patients and families to sign up. After patients pass and the tissue's been donated, I can tell you that we have a follow-up. There's always a neuropathology follow-up. And so it's not only beneficial from a research perspective to have this tissue available for research, but clinically, we also get feedback and can use that moving forward in case there were other issues that we suspected or were picked up on only neuropathology. And so we learn clinically what goes on when people donate tissue, as well as having that tissue available for research. And I really do appreciate that follow-up from as a clinician. And finally, I think that as a clinician and seeing people through clinic, we can provide that clinical base and input on the tissue that gets used for research. And vice versa. Just this week, we had someone from Dr. McCarroll's lab in clinic with us to see what patients experience and to give that some context. And that hopefully will feed back and give ideas. So it's a collaborative effort once we have that tissue to do the research on. And as a clinician, I can provide some of that insight, how patients and families live. But I think that I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's input in terms of how this tissue is obtained and used. But from a clinical perspective, we start talking about it early, and it's just a routine part of what we do, as well as having a pipeline to donate that tissue based on what patients and families' preferences are. That's all that I had from the clinical perspective, and I'll hand it back to you, Dr. Fox. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Frank. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. McCarroll to talk a little about the kind of research that his lab does using human brain tissue. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I wanted to share some of the experience of a scientist who's been able to work with brain tissue donated by Huntington's patients and families to try to better understand how the genetic cause of Huntington's disease leads to the actual biological symptoms of the disease, something that scientists in my lab are really focused on, including the scientists that Dr. Frank just mentioned, who had the wonderful opportunity to spend a day in his clinic, also interacting with patients and seeing what the clinical aspects of care in Huntington's are like. And this is also research that's all been in close collaboration with Dr. Sabina Beretta, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes. So one thing I just want to say is that, from the perspective of a scientist and someone who runs a lab where we work with brain tissue donations that's been contributed by patients and families, is just the great respect and enormous care with which scientists treat and handle this tissue. I mean, I think we're always aware when we work with brain tissue from patients that this was an enormous gift and an enormously important part of a person's body and existence for a very long time. And so tissue is handled with great respect and enormous care. It's also an incredibly valuable research resource that we're very careful with. A second thing that I think that's important to understand is that the privacy of brain donors and their family members is carefully protected. We never use in the lab people's names or any identifying information like their geography, where they're from, birthday, or anything like that. And in fact, just because, humans make mistakes, there's all kinds of precautions that Sabina could tell you about to just make sure that these things don't even slip out by mistake. So for example, that kind of information never even comes to my lab and we never even see it. We know necessary things about the clinical histories of patients that are helpful in relating their clinical histories and their health histories to the things that we study in their brain tissue. But no, we don't ever have access to identifying information about patients, so that even in a world of, again, scientists are humans and humans make mistakes, but even in that world, it's just, there are all kinds of precautions to make sure that that kind of information is protected and never slips out. The other thing I want to mention is that every brain donation can and does support hundreds of research studies. And I know Sabina will tell you more about this also, but our lab uses only a tiny bit of each brain donation because cells are extremely small, and even a dime-sized piece of brain tissue contains millions of cells for us to study. So I think it's important to remember that one brain donation goes a very long way in supporting potentially hundreds of research projects on questions related to Huntington's disease all over the world. I do want to share just a few insights from our research with tissue that's been contributed by Huntington's patients and families. And in particular, just to tell you a really brief research story about a way in which these brain tissue donations are helping to answer longstanding questions about Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease, as I'm sure you know, is caused by a DNA repeat in which a sequence DNA sequence, CAG, is repeated a variable number of times. So within the Huntington's gene, there's sort of regular DNA sequence, but then there will be a specific interval over which this DNA sequence, CAG, is repeated. And we all inherit versions or alleles of the Huntington's gene in which this sequence is repeated a variable number of times. But when it's repeated when people inherit an allele in which it's repeated a larger number of times, 36 or more, that these are the versions of this gene or alleles of this gene that lead to Huntington's disease. And also, as I'm sure you're aware, scientists in this area have been working for a very long time to try to understand questions like, well, why is it that these versions or alleles lead to the symptoms of Huntington's disease, whereas these ones don't? And why is a person who inherits an allele like this, why are they healthy for decades before developing any symptoms of Huntington's disease and then develop such profound symptoms over the following decades? So I just want to share a couple slides about a recent insight that our team and others have been able to make from working with these kinds of brain tissue donations from persons who had Huntington's disease during their lifetimes. And in particular, if you just take the example of a person who inherited an allele of the Huntington gene with 40 CAG repeats at the beginning of their life, one of the things that the study of their brain tissue at their end of life, i.e. decades later, is teaching us is that in many ways, their brain tissue has two kinds of cells. There are cells in which this DNA repeat essentially stayed the same or maybe got a little bit longer. And that what we're finding is that those cells in general remain mostly healthy or relatively normal throughout that person's life, even all the way to the end. But that what we're finding in each patient is a subset of cells in which this DNA repeat had clearly expanded and become extremely long. And that these are the cells whose biology becomes transformed in the disease. And this process is called somatic expansion. It was earlier scientific research had already taught us that somatic expansion is a thing, but what we've been able to find from studying this brain tissue is that the cells in which these long somatic expansions of the DNA repeat take place are precisely the cells that become biologically dysfunctional and then are lost. And also the ability to study brain tissue from patients with Huntington's disease at a variety of ages and at a variety of disease stages, from early stages to late stages, is also teaching us that this expansion of this DNA repeat in the Huntington's gene is a very slow process. It takes decades. You can see that from that, if you look at a patient early in life when they have no symptoms, that the DNA repeat is about the same length as what they inherited from their parents. But if you look decades later, when someone may have early symptoms of the disorder, that it has become longer. And that if you look decades after that at the stage of advanced illness, that it's become extremely long in precisely the cells that became sick. So we increasingly think of this DNA repeat as a kind of a slowly ticking DNA clock. Now, every brain donation tells a story about how Huntington's disease has played out in one person's brain. And I think an important thing to understand is that first, these stories share important commonalities. There are biological things that we're finding that all patients have in common, but also that they're not identical, that every brain tells us a slightly different story about how this disorder played out in a different person. And the reason that's true is that we all have different life and health histories and different genetics. And this leads to a situation in which no two people have exactly the same course, even though there are important things they share in common. So there are many insights, biological insights now that from this kind of research come from things that we're finding all persons with Huntington's appear to share in common. So for example, as far as we can tell, every patient that we've analyzed so far has this somatic expansion that I told you about, the kind of ticking DNA clock. But other kinds of insights come from differences or variation among individual persons with Huntington's disease. So for example, we're increasingly realizing that this ticking DNA clock runs faster or slower in different persons with Huntington's disease. And we and other scientists are working to understand why this is the case. So some key next research questions that we and others are working hard to answer. One is, what has caused this ticking DNA clock to run more quickly or slowly in different persons with Huntington's disease? What biological or genetic factors slow this clock? And one of the reasons this is important to understand is that we really want to help toward developing new kinds of interventions or medicines that slow or stop this DNA expansion, this kind of ticking DNA clock. The other question that we're working to answer with these brain donations is, how far along is the DNA clock in different people who had different levels of HD symptoms at the end of life? And we think that this can inform development and clinical trials of medicines that are directed at this aspect of Huntington's disease biology. Now, of course, the story that I've told you is just one story from our own research. These kinds of brain tissue donations any individual donation is used by hundreds of researchers and research labs to ask and answer a wide variety of research questions. And so this is just one example, but I'm glad to be able to share it, and I'll be happy at the end of the webinar to answer any questions. But the thing I want to emphasize is that none of these kinds of insights would be possible without these kinds of brain donations from patients and families. These are just not the kinds of things that you can learn by studying animals and cells in a dish and things like that.
Thank you so much, Steve, for making that as simple as possible. I know it's, scientists in the field are really excited about the work that your lab is doing towards HD. So thank you. And I'm now going to pass it over to Sabina Beretta. Thanks, Dr. Beretta.
Thank you. And sorry, let me try to. I would like to start by thanking each and every person attending this webinar or watching it later on. The topic of brain donation is particularly difficult to think about, and the fact that you are here to learn from it, considering it, is attest to your generosity. We were just reminded of how valuable of a gift of knowledge is a brain donation. And here, my job today is to tell you a little bit about how it works. I represent the Harvard Brain Tissue Resource Center, which is one of the National Institute of Health Neurobiobank repository, together with another 5 repositories with whom we collaborate very closely. And our mission, as well as that of the Neurobiobank, is to advance research on human brain and brain disorders. And we do this by collecting postmortem, after death, human brains, and distributing tissue samples to investigators both within the US and across the world. And ultimately, obviously, the goal is to identify the underlying causes of Huntington disease and potential new targets for treatment. Our tissue repository has a very long-standing history of focus on Huntington disease. Our brain bank was founded in 1978 by Dr. Edward Bird, who was a pioneer in research on Huntington disease, and started a process for collecting brain donations that has since developed and expanded to the point that now hundreds of studies from Huntington disease have been generated from our collection. So how does this work? The first thing I can tell you is that it is possible to register to become a brain donor. This is not, it's helpful, but it's not essential. The reason it is helpful, is because It is important for people that intend to become brain donor to discuss it with their families, or the family to discuss together and make sure that everybody is in agreement, and particularly that everybody understands the process. It is not a consent, it's just expressing an intention. It is not binding. And in fact, we rely on the family to collaborate with us to receive each brain donation. We rely on the family to call us and let us know when it is time. So the most important thing to know is that timing is absolutely critical. From the time of donor's passing to the time we need to receive the brain to our laboratories, we only have 24 hours, and we try to keep it even shorter than that. This means that the family needs to notify us either immediately before, if it is understood that passing may be imminent, or within few hours from the donor's passing. And I'll take you through a few steps that are important to know. The first is, as I mentioned, to call us. This is Darren Chernicki. He's one of our clinical liaisons and donation coordinators. And in fact, the ability we have to collect brain donation from across the US within 24 hours is based on the dedication and hard work of people like Darren and other donation coordinators who are on call 24/7 every day of the year, and will pick up the call immediately and talk with the family members. So we need to perform a quick screening process, and once we know we can accept the brain donation, we'll review the consent form with the legal next of kin. But again, I'll emphasize how important it is to call us as soon as possible, within hours or even before the donor's passing. The next step is brain recovery and transport. And an important thing to know here is that at that point, we try to take over the process. We try to not to involve family members who are going through such an incredibly difficult moment in their lives. And particularly important, we cover all costs related to brain donation. We will never ask a family member to contribute to the expenses. At this point, I need to make a brief pause and tell you about what is the most difficult and challenging part of our work. And that is that despite our best effort and all preparations, at times we're not able to accept the brain donation. And we do understand that this is a particularly difficult thing for families, particularly those that are really committed to brain donation. So what are reasons when this may happen? And we try to keep it as rare as possible. At times, the tissue may not be viable for research. For instance, the donor may have had a major stroke that damaged the brain beyond what we can do with the research. There are safety concerns. There are certain infectious diseases that may pose a danger to both the pathologist who will do the brain recovery, us and investigators, so we can't accept brain donations from donors that are known to be positive for HIV, Hep B, or Hep C, or for prion diseases. And finally, at times there are logistic factors, such as we can complete a brain donation within the time frame we have. Excuse me. The next important step is that we need to learn as much as possible from a clinical point of view for each donor. And for this, we collaborate with the family to collect health records and clinical information. And this, as Steve mentioned, is critical to interpret data from any of the studies. We need to understand the clinical history, the family histories, medications, and many other factors which are shared with investigators in a de-identified manner to protect the privacy of the donors and their family, but they are truly critical to every study. Excuse me. In order to increase our knowledge and to confirm the diagnosis and learn more about each donor, we perform a neuropathology report. Dr. Derek Oakley in this picture is our neuropathologist. And I saw a question in the chat. We do share the neuropathology with the family members, with the legal next of kin, as well as, and not only when authorized by the legal next of kin, we can share it with other parties, such as clinicians. Excuse me. Once we have collected as much information as possible about each donor, we will meet as a sort of like a case conference with each of us very different areas of expertise, both in clinical, in research and neuropathology. And we discuss each brain donation to formulate a set of diagnoses. At this point, we are ready to distribute the tissue to investigators. And of course, the most important step is research, being able to share these samples with investigators so that they can carry out their research on Huntington disease. And I really want to emphasize how impactful each brain donation is, saying that from each brain, there are samples that are distributed truly across the world and participated in many hundreds of studies. I would like to leave you with one more message, an important one, which is that we all can help research by registering or considering to become brain donors. And this is because in order to understand what changes happen underlying each brain disorder, such as Huntington, we need comparison groups that help us understand the human brain better, but also understand what changes in the brain of people that suffer from brain disorders. I'd like to thank all of you, but first and foremost, all tissue donors and their families, and you for your very kind attention. I hope to be able to address your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beretta, for explaining that really compassionately and talking a little more about how it works at the Brain Donation Center. I'm going to pass it over now to Cheryl Sullivan-Stavely, who is a HD family member and can share a little more about her personal experience with brain donation.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to share my two very positive experiences with brain donation for my first husband, John, and my younger daughter, Megan. In 1989, so HD has affected my family for 34 years. My first husband, John, at the age of 37, was diagnosed with HD. We had been given conflicting and inaccurate information, so we never really knew that HD was in the family. At that time, our daughters, Caitlin, was 8 and Megan was 2. And John knew in life he was going to do everything and anything that he could to help advance the education of HD, and he was a great educator and advocator. So clinical trials were extremely important to John, and he participated in many. And the most impressive clinical trial that he participated in was in 1996, when he underwent a fetal pig tissue transplant. They inserted fetal pig into the damaged portion of John's brain to see Could these cells regenerate? Could they stop the progression of HD? Could it be cured? Nobody knew, but John was very willing to participate in this ultimate clinical trial. This was sponsored in part by Boston Medical Center, Boston University, and Genzyme and Diaprin. John was followed very closely for several years after the fetal pig tissue transplant, and the people at Boston University and medical centers wanted to know, would John consider donating his brain when he passed away so that they could study what happened exactly in his brain, particularly in regards to the fetal pig tissue transplant. And of course, John consented right away. Somewhere during those 5 years, we signed some papers, and I knew that this was John's wishes. Fast forward to the summer of 2008, when John was essentially on hospice. I talked to a nurse and a social worker at Boston Medical Center. They came out. I had to sign a couple of more papers, fill out a couple of forms on behalf of John. I was his legal guardian. The forms were very simple, but the nurse and the social worker were able to help me if I had any questions. They gave me a card with a number on it to call, 24/7. And hopefully during my talk, I'll be reiterating everything that Sam, Steve, and Sabina have presented here. Shortly after John's passing, in the morning of September 15th of 2008, I called the 24/7 number. I didn't wait too long because I was very intent on making sure that the brain, was harvested in enough time. Fortunately, we just live 1 hour north of Boston. So I knew when I called Boston Medical Center, this wasn't going to be a problem. Also, ahead of time, I knew the funeral home that we would be using, and I had called the funeral director to let him know that John's brain was going to be donated. And, so he was alert to this fact. When I called the number at BU, or Boston Medical Center, I explained where the funeral home was, and I would say John passed away about 6 in the morning, and by noontime, the gentleman that came to harvest John's brain had already been to the funeral home and got John's brain. Sean, the funeral director, let me know that he said this man just was so respectful of harvesting John's brain. And he said, I really want you to know that and to understand the dignity, and the respect which he gave John. And that made me, feel really good. I want to emphasize that if you so choose, you can still have an open casket. You can't tell that the brain was removed. And I know for us, that was very important, and for other people, it may be too. So again, it didn't interfere in the mourning or the wake process, for John. And again, as Sabina said, there is absolutely no cost. Again, I realized this was going to Boston University. It went to the neuropathologist, Dr. Ann McKee, who is director of the BU Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center. I don't know that it was called that in 2008, but a couple of months after John's passing, she sent me a very lovely thank you letter and a copy of John's brain autopsy and things that they found or didn't find in related to the fetal pig tissue, but just in general, how that even more than just the fetal pig tissue transplant, that John's brain would again help to advance knowledge of HD. In 2007, my younger daughter, Megan, who was then 19, was diagnosed with juvenile HD. And you can see here on the screen pictures of John and Megan. Megan knew, just like her dad, in life, clinical trials were very important, but that her best legacy would be to donate her brain. And so for the 7 years that she was affected and sick with HD, she knew that she wanted to do this. And in my telling this story, I also want to say, do as I say, not as I did. In the early, late winter, early spring of 2014, Megan, who was 26 at the time, then went on hospice. And we knew she probably had a few months, but weren't sure. I knew she wanted to donate her brain, but I still hadn't, it was something like, oh yes, I will do that tomorrow. I will do that tomorrow. Well, Friday in early May of 2014, I get a call from the nursing home where Megan had resided for 3 years. And they said Megan was unresponsive and to make sure that I got there right away. I went up with my second husband, Kevin, and I went into a panic mode, not only because I knew I was losing Megan, but that I had not yet registered with the Harvard Brain Tissue Resource or the Harvard Brain Bank for Megan. Kevin immediately went onto his iPad and he registered Megan. Again, it was very simple. A little while later, I did speak to somebody and they said, yes, it is all set. Megan is registered. If I had that to do over again, I would not wait till 3 days before Megan passed away. But thankfully, again, because the registration was simple, and when they asked me, again, Megan was a good candidate for brain donations. 3 days later, on May 12th, Megan passed away about 1 o'clock in the morning. Again, we had used the same funeral home, and I had awarded the funeral director that Megan's brain would be donated. So shortly after Megan passed away, I called the 24/7 number. They had to fax me over, again, because I was her next of kin and permission, they had to fax over a couple of forms, which probably, again, if I had done this, in a more timely manner, that would have been all set. But the nurses there helped me. When Sean from the funeral home came to pick up Megan's body, he knew that within probably 8 or 9 o'clock later that morning, someone would be coming to harvest Megan's brain. When the gentleman came to harvest Megan's brain at the funeral home, Sean immediately recognized him as being the same gentleman that had received John's brain. And Sean made sure to tell him that Megan was the daughter of John. And again, Sean just said, he said, again, all along, he was very respectful, very, had so much dignity, but he said, even if possible, I think there was even more, and he was acutely aware of the gift that Megan was given, that her father had given, and that here's a father-daughter, and it was just extremely touching. And I'm very grateful to Sean telling me that story, because again, it gave me, so much peace. Again, with Megan, we were able to have the open casket, no problem. A few days after Megan's passing, I got an informational package from the Harvard Brain Bank. In it, there was all kinds of information about the process of brain donations, what measures are followed to protect the confidentiality of Megan's donation. Also, there was a nice letter from the director, and who I don't believe was Sabina at the time, who said that, I could call the brain bank at any time, talk with the director if I had any questions or concerns. In that package, there was also a medical release form, as they wanted to get information from anybody that had cared for Megan, particularly in the realm of her Huntington's disease. So I just had to sign the release. These forms went to, one of them was Dr. Sam Frank, who was our family neurologist, a previous neurologist, the nursing home where Megan had resided at. So they all received the release forms, and then they each were able to submit, as Sabina was alluding to, their medical, medical records that each of them had in regards to Megan. There was also a questionnaire that I had to fill out. It was about maybe 15 or 20 pages long. And again, this started with questions about my pregnancy with Megan, about her lifelong medical history, social, family, educational history, all the medications she had been on, all the information, again, that the doctors have alluded to. Again, they reminded me all of this was confidential. I would say it probably took me about 4 to 6 weeks after Megan's passing to fill out this form and to send, the release forms. And about at the end of September of 2014, I received a very thoughtful letter with a copy of Megan's brain autopsy report from the Harvard, Brain Bank. They said that they were utilizing the right half of her brain at that moment, and that they confirmed that they would only distribute samples from the right half of Megan's brain at that time only to the finest and most reputable labs in the world, and that the left half of the brain was being stored at that moment. Again, if I had any questions or concerns, I could call. And I just want to say, from a personal point of view, I was very proud of John and Megan for wanting to do this to advance, HD knowledge and research. Also, but just what a tribute to their legacy, and that it gave our family a lot of peace, and it was just a positive and good feeling to know that even in death, they're making a difference. So I thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I know that there's a few folks in the chat who have just expressed their gratitude that you're able and willing to share your experience there. So thank you. I'm going to actually invite Kelly, my colleague Kelly Andrew, to share a quick slide so that everybody has the link to learn more about the registration process for this. So go ahead, Kelly.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. As a reminder, this session is being recorded, so all the conversations you just heard will be available for you to watch later on HDSA's YouTube page. I also went ahead and threw in the chat the link to access the McLean Brain Bank website, and you can see it on this slide here as well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions in the chat. So we just wanted to leave that up for just a moment so that those who are watching this after the fact, I just have that link, who aren't able to see the chat, but maybe we will just share all the videos now when you're ready to take that down. Thank you. Yeah, so tons of questions here. We have a few minutes. We can always follow up afterwards for anything we don't get to. But I'm gonna start with one here about someone who is asking about if they've registered at a different place. For example, there's other hospitals that aren't part of the sort of NIH system. If they are comfortable with one avenue of brain donation over another, do they need to sort of withdraw registrations in other places? And sort of in conjunction with that, if somebody wants to donate to a statewide program for anatomical donations, eye donations, how does that loop in with brain donation here? So maybe that's a question for Sabina.
Yeah, those are very good questions, and and very important ones. A registration, again, is not a consent, so people can withdraw their registration from us or from other programs as they prefer. But the ultimate choice on where to donate, which repository, occurs at the time of the actual brain donation. So after the person passes, the consent is done after that. So anybody can choose or change their mind about where to donate at that moment. Of course, finding information ahead of time is really helpful. With regard to anatomical gift programs, some programs are compatible with brain donation, some aren't. So it's good to know ahead of time and perhaps either contact us for information or other programs to make sure that that works. We usually are happy to try to find out information for people that call us. And I wanted to emphasize, please call us if you have questions. There is always somebody on the line that will answer any question in this regard. If you just want information, please chat with us.
Sabina, thank you for that. And thank you to all of the speakers for talking about what I think all of us believe is a really important topic. And I know it's sometimes a hard conversation for people to have, but really important that we're doing so and that people are thinking about this. A question that came in that I think is an interesting one, which, when we talk about HD as being a family disease, is there a way to potentially link samples from different family members if they say are donated to different programs? Is there a way to coordinate those, to connect those?
That's another really great question. Unfortunately, not at the moment. So if more than one family member donates to the same repository, of course we would know. And that actually is really, really helpful. It happens several times and it is invaluable from a research point of view. But if they are donated to different repositories, that becomes more difficult because of privacy protection.
Thanks, Sabina. I think that's for folks that are listening, and please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, if you haven't already donated your brain, but you're thinking about it and others in your family are, making sure that you all are doing it to the same repository allows that to happen in an easier manner. Awesome. All the more for planning ahead.
See a question here about someone who completed the process with a loved one about 10 years ago, and notes that it was hard after the person had passed to provide certain types of clinical information, such as events or injuries in the person's childhood. So maybe you can talk a little bit about whether that registration process includes that, or how you obtain that clinical information that maybe is easier for the person themselves to give.
Thank you. Another great question. Our process for registration is a bit different now than it was in 2014. So we gather a lot more information now doing the registration than we used to. We are planning to expand that even more, and perhaps with the consent of the donor and their family, to contact them on regular intervals to retrieve more information. Yet it is really important to also do that after that. And I do understand that there are many challenges. At times hospitals, are, for their own privacy protection regulation, are not particularly willing to share health records. So another way we can help is collaborating with the families. So at times they send the release to us, and then we will work with the hospital instead of having the family go through several calls. But both are really important, and I am sorry to hear that that was so difficult. We're working to make this as smooth as we can and improving.
Sabina, thanks for that. And I'll just add, and maybe Sam, you can comment to this too, is if you are a person living with HD or you have a loved one who's living with HD and they are working with a provider, particularly someone we know like Dr. Frank at one of the HDSA Centers of Excellence, if you're working with your provider, can you start having those conversations earlier so that the doctor can also help guide you through that process and help shepherd making sure your records get to are connected to your brain?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that when patients express a preference to donate tissue after they pass, we don't do anything differently in terms of their records. We just know that there's going to be a records release request that is coming. So the only other thing I do is I have my administrative staff specifically look out to that to see what we can do to make that process go as smoothly and quickly as possible.
Thank you.
So I know that there have been a couple of questions, scientific questions answered privately, but I do want to ask Dr. McCarroll to maybe clarify a little bit about somatic expansion. Someone's asked, does this, are you saying that, you know, there are cells in our bodies where the CAG repeat that has been tested in someone's blood is changing over time? So if you could just kind of reiterate that point, that would be great.
Definitely. So that's exactly what we're finding, is that the allele that people are that the allele that people inherit, and that's kind of diagnostic with regard to having Huntington's disease in one's future, may not itself be the toxic entity. It may actually be that the allele that people inherit, if it were stable, would actually be perfectly fine. But what's problematic about it is that it's unstable and that it slowly expands throughout life and becomes toxic later. So it's a different way of thinking about the underlying cause of the disease than we had thought about it in the past. And it's something that these brain tissue donations have uniquely been able to teach us. It doesn't mean that the DNA test is less relevant or less important to get. It just means that because I think that what that DNA test still tells you is that it still tells someone whether the allele that they inherited is the unstable kind that will have the tendency to do this. It just means that that isn't itself the form that makes neurons sick.
Steve, thank you for that. I first want to say thank you all for your time. I know that we are a couple of minutes over, but if you have the ability to stay on for just a few more minutes, we might ask a couple more questions. If you have to leave, we absolutely get it and respect it and want to thank you all for your time. We won't keep this going for too long, but if we can just answer a couple more questions for folks, that would be fantastic. A question that came in that I think is interesting. I know Cheryl shared about having the reports for both her loved ones, and someone said if they did not get a report, is there a way that they can get that after the fact? Can they follow up and potentially get a copy of the neuropathology report that was done several years prior?
Can I just
Oh, yes, go ahead, please.
answer that? Oh, I'm sorry. So, yeah, also in John's case, I had a little bit of difficulty, and then I contacted Dr. Frank, who was able to contact Dr. McKee and give me a copy. I didn't have any problem with the Hartman McLean Brain Bank, but seeing Dr. Frank was very helpful. So I would suggest that that's also possible, but I'm willing to bet if you called, you know, wherever the brain would be donated, because I do feel that that is part of what the family is expecting. So that was just my experience. Thanks.
Sabina, can you say anything to that from the operational side?
Yeah, it is always possible to get a copy of the neuropathology report. We wait until we have all the health records and family questionnaire to share it, because part of that information is necessary to complete the neuropath report. So sometimes there is a bit of a domino effect. But please contact us if you haven't received it. It takes us a while to put it together. But if it's been over a year, please do let us know, and we will make sure that we address it. The one thing that at times becomes a bit difficult is we can only share the neuropathology report with the legal next of kin, or with the legal next of kin authorization. We can share it with other family members or clinicians. So we have to be sure that we are talking with the legal next of kin in order to do that.
Thanks, Sabina. We have a couple of geography questions. There's folks saying, oh, I live in California, I live in Texas. Are there ways that you collaborate with other collection centers, or does it matter where you're located if you want to donate specifically to the HPTRC?
It doesn't matter as long as it is within the US. We can collect in any states across the board. We do collaborate with other sites, but the brain goes to the site that they worked with the family. So there is absolutely nothing wrong in choosing a different site. But we can collect from anywhere, California or anywhere on the West Coast or anywhere in the US. So we do this by working with a network of pathologists and recovery specialists that are independent people, the technicians, or again, neuropathologists, that will work with us to recover the brain, and then we have a courier that sends it to our laboratories. So if you choose our repository, we can do it from anywhere in the country. But again, donating to other brain banks is also just as useful.
Sabina, thank you for that. And I know, unfortunately, Dr. Frank had to jump off because he, as you saw, was calling from his clinic room and had to move on so that he could see other patients. But I just want to add to what Sabina shared. This was something that we would talk about in clinic, right? It's not that you needed to live in proximity to the repository. You needed to be able to plan enough in advance so that you knew who to call at the time that your loved one died, right? So that, and even Cheryl said this, right? It's not necessarily that you have to go to a hospital, it's going to a funeral home or working with someone in your community that handles bodies after a person dies. So this is something that is not specifically linked to being in a hospital system. It is working with Sabina and her team, working with your clinician, working with the people at the funeral home in your area, that all of these get linked together so that the donation request is fulfilled in a timely way. So I just wanted to add that, thinking that may have been something Sam added, but it is a coordinated effort, and all the more reason that it's important that you have these conversations starting now.
Thank you, Eric. It's absolutely true. And again, we have clinical liaisons on the phone all the time, and people just call us to discuss it and learn more about it. And they might be considering it for themselves or family members. There will always be somebody that can provide information on how it works, the logistics, sending information. So yeah, thinking ahead of time is important. But again, I also want to emphasize, we can take a cold call. If you never contacted us, if you never registered, and you decide on the spot, that works too.
Well, thank you so much again to all of our speakers. This is, again, a very sensitive and important topic, and we've had a wonderful turnout today from folks who wanted to learn more about this. So thank you for making that information accessible and easy to understand. And we will reach out to our speakers with any follow-up questions. You can please feel free to reach out to HDSA if you feel that your personal question hasn't been answered, and we'll help to follow up with our speakers. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again at our next HDSA research webinar, and we'll put the info out there on our YouTube and Facebook channels about that. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.